Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of the Hobbit Trilogy. So, I just saw the new Hobbit movie, the final installment in the trilogy, The Battle of the Five Armies. So, while it's still fresh in my mind, I thought I'd give a real quick impressions on the entire trilogy as a whole. But don't worry, because I know the third movie just came out, I'll be careful not to give away any spoilers, but I make no such promise regarding the first two movies, as you should have seen them by now. So, what I'm about to say is something I've heard every single person I talk to about these movies say. There's not a single person I talk to about the Hobbit movies that hasn't said this, and that is this should not be a trilogy. This should be one movie, two at most. I know a lot happens in the books, even though it's a small book, so I could see two movies, but three is absolutely pushing it. The whole storyline with Gandalf and Galadriel and Saruman and Sauron and all that stuff about the necromancer, all that should not have been there. It did absolutely nothing except detract from the main story of The Hobbit, which should have been the only story they focused on. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Lord of the Rings movies. I dare say I would proclaim it the best film trilogy in existence. The Hobbit film trilogy is mediocre at best, and at worst, a huge disappointment. Doesn't even begin to come near the sheer awesome and epicness of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Part of the problem with this trilogy is that it tries far too hard to be a prequel to the Lord of the Rings when it should really just be its own thing. Some people prefer the Hobbit book over the Lord of the Rings books, and some people prefer the Lord of the Rings books over the Hobbit books. It all depends on your personal preferences, really, as both are awesome books. However, I doubt there will be a single person out there who prefers the Hobbit movies over the Lord of the Rings movies. They're simply objectively not as good. And another problem is, although the Hobbit novel has an entirely different feel to it than the Lord of the Rings novels, which is why some people prefer it, the Hobbit movies have the same feel as the Lord of the Rings movies, just done much more poorly, which is why no one would prefer it. The Hobbit was written first as a fun kids novel, and years later, when asked to do a sequel, Tolkien produced a book so big it had to be separated into three books of this epic journey war story that was definitely more geared towards adults and children. So the two had two entirely different feels, and instead of the movie trying to honor this, they purposely tried to give The Hobbit the same sort of epic scale, and that meant artificially trying to raise the stakes, the action, and the amount of characters, and it simply does not work. Ultimately, these movies feel less like an adaptation of a novel and more like a movie prequel to a movie trilogy, and that it fails miserably. Now, I'm not a book purist, far from it. I'm not one of these people who thinks film adaptations of novels should be word for word adaptations of what you see on the page. I think that's entirely unreasonable, and I'm very willing to give film makers a wide berth in changing the story in order to suit the film. For example, I strongly felt that The Lord of the Rings were really good adaptations, even though it's, blasphemy. I'd even go as far to say they improved upon the original source material. And this, despite all the changes that they made, such as Tom Bombadil not being in it, leaving out the scarring of the Shire, having Frodo push Sam away, and having the elves show up at Helm's Deep. That last one, by the way, I thought was a huge improvement, and it kind of irritates me when people complain about that. So when I heard they were having Legolas in these films and introducing new characters, I was fine with that. Alarm bells didn't go off for me. I just thought as long as it works. But the problem is it doesn't work. The Hobbit trilogy is not a good adaptation, not because it makes changes from the books, but because it fails to deliver the same feel and themes as the book, and it gets too bogged down in trying to be prequel to the Lord of the Rings that it fails to tell a good story. You definitely feel Hollywood's involvement more in these films, with a lot of silly, over-the-top action sequences that seem to belong more in a Pirates of the Caribbean movie or a horrible Die Hard sequel rather than a Tolkien-esque film. That's not to say Lord of the Rings didn't have its moments, but they weren't as ridiculous or numerous, and they actually worked for the story. Whereas these feel added in for the express purpose of packing in more action for a movie. The first movie, An Unexpected Journey, was my least favorite of the bunch, as it was poorly paced, dragged on for far too long, featured a lot of boring, unnecessary scenes like Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, and Saruman sitting around a table talking for 20 minutes about shit that wasn't in the book, and lots of unnecessary, ridiculous, drawn out fight scenes with goblins with scrotum beards chasing the dwarves. The second film, The Desolation of Smaug, would be my favorite out of the three. This also has some ridiculous action sequences like the barrel scene, which was just stupid, and plus had a ridiculous romance between the Kate elf and the dwarf who looks more attractive than any other dwarf, which was poorly executed and cliched. However, I felt it was far more punchy than the first, didn't drag on as much, and featured some awesome sequences such as the spider scenes, which is very nicely done, but most of all the Smaug scenes. I think I'd call this my favorite of the trilogy for the Smaug scenes alone. It was just so well done, so scary. I can imagine watching this as a kid and having nightmares for a month straight. However, my main complaint about this film would be the way it ended, which in my opinion is the worst place to end a movie in history. They might as well just cut Bilbo off mid-sentence. He'd be like, "Oh, I figured out how to defeat Smaug. All we need to do is..." That wouldn't have been much worse than what they actually did. You may consider this a spoiler for the third film, but only in regards to the first 15 minutes of the film, so I don't really think it's a spoiler, especially if you've read the books. But let me just say the situation with the dragon is resolved in the first 15 minutes of the film, even before the freaking title credits come up. So what in the hell was the fucking point in saving this for the third film? This was literally the worst decision ever. This should have been at the end of the second film. It would have made much more sense as it was resolving that storyline. Instead, they make us wait for a year when we're no longer as excited about what's going on with the dragon, not as invested with the action, and therefore don't care as much, and it just resolves right away, and then they move on to another story. What was the fucking point in that? I just don't get it. Anyway, as for the third film, The Battle of the Five Armies, I was hoping that this would be like the Star Wars prequels, where the third film is the greatest and the first two were just building up to this great conclusion that would save the trilogy. Unfortunately, that was not the case. I still like this film better than the first, but it was just a lot of drawn out battle sequences that went on for far too long, too much action, not enough story, and also too much CGI. Really, I know they use CGI a lot in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but it was combined with practical effects. This film just went overboard with it to the point where it felt like I was playing a computer game or watching a cartoon. Also, I gotta say, for a movie called The Hobbit barely appeared in this film. Bilbo felt like he was just a supporting character in this film and not the central point of the film. I do think he was the central focus of the first two films, but with this film it felt like he wasn't really important to what was going on at all, and they could have just as easily cut him out altogether and you would have never noticed. And the ending was too abrupt. It didn't really tie everything up. It's just like after three-hour movies, now it's just over. I suppose after all the whining about the long Return of the King ending, Peter Jackson was just sick about hearing about it, so just did a much quicker ending for The Hobbit, which is a shame because I thought the ending of Return of the King was fine, and this one should have been more like that. It irritates me to no end when people whine about the ending, because there was literally no other way to end such an epic trilogy. If they left out any of those so-called multiple endings, it would have been hugely disappointing. Well, except maybe the thing with Sam at the very end. That was a tad bit unnecessary, but everything else was totally needed. So overall, the Hobbit trilogy was a pale shadow of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It tried too much to be like the prequel to the Lord of the Rings, and it was more like a typical Hollywood action adventure, and it failed on both accounts. It was all over the place with the plot, too many characters, and this should have been much more focused story, which is what The Hobbit should be compared to The Lord of the Rings. So in a rating out of 10, I give The Hobbit An Unexpected Journey a 5, average. The Hobbit The Desolation of Smaug a 7, very good. And The Hobbit The Battle of the Five Armies a 6, good. And I give the trilogy overall a 6. Good. Slightly above average. I would recommend watching it if you got nothing better to do and you need to pass the time. But it's a bit disappointing as a follow-up to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I would give a 10. Well, that's it for my review on The Hobbit. Be sure to subscribe and check out my channel for other movies and TV reviews. I'm currently doing a series of videos on my top 50 favorite movies, so you should check that out. And thanks a lot for watching.